Anyway, and so it's great to be here with you, even virtually. It is gray and cloudy here too, but also cold. So I think it was about 20 when I was walking the dog this morning, and it was rainy yesterday, so it was icy out too. So there's that. So at least you don't have to worry about that. Well, anyway, like I said, it's good to be with you. We hear people talk about freedom a lot, usually in a political context. Uh, Most of us have the good fortune to live in a society where freedom has been the norm for us, even to be able to take our freedom for granted in large part. So we know you've probably heard the old song by Nina Simone, how it feels to be free. Understandably, though, many of us are concerned right now that we may lose some freedom, and we're trying to preserve it. And we should. We should make a concerted effort to sustain a free society. Even those of us who may not be directly affected by threats to our civil liberty, we see the benefit of living in a world where everyone is equally free. But there are people who want the freedom to get rich at the expense of others. And there's people who want the freedom to oppress people whose views they don't like. If someone or some group is oppressed, then we don't live in a free society. We live in a culture of oppression. If our society enables greed, then we make people poor. So freedom to oppress others isn't freedom, it's oppression. And unbridled greed isn't prosperity, it's poverty. So maybe what it means to be free isn't all that clear cut. If we're concerned about freedom, we should give some thought to this, to what it really means to be free. The Buddha once talked to a group of monks about freedom, and he asked, "What is freedom?" There's a worldly freedom, the freedom connected with the physical world. But what is true freedom? There's that spiritual freedom when a person looks into their heart and finds it free from greed, free from hatred, and free from delusion. And then there arises true freedom. So true freedom in this sense is independent from social freedom. We can be free when people around us are not, and even when we're not physically free. But we still have a responsibility to our society to build an infrastructure that's both peaceful and just, because as compassionate people, we want everyone to know how it feels to be free. But we're better able to do that if we can also accept our responsibility to free our minds. So some of you know I used to spend Tuesday afternoons leading Buddhist services at the chapel at Tomoka Correctional Institution, which is outside of Daytona Beach. It was one of the most rewarding things that I've done in my career, having the opportunity to help people who live in a very challenging circumstance to have some peace, some mental freedom. And being in a place where people were not free in the worldly sense really taught me a lot about what it means to be free in the spiritual sense. So when you come into the compound, you check in at the control room, and there's a hand scanner that identifies you by your handprint. And then they let you through this big chain link gate and into an enclosed area. And there you go through a metal detector and an officer x-rays whatever you're bringing in. And then someone screens you with a wand. Sometimes they pat you down too, just to make extra sure you're not bringing in anything that you shouldn't. And finally, they give you a body alarm to take with you, which is this little plastic black thing with a button on it. My friend Paul, who's a Zen monk, too, says it looks like his garage door opener, and it does kind of have that look to it. So the idea is that if violence breaks out somewhere, wherever it is that you're going, you can set off an alarm, and that'll send officers to your assistance. Thankfully, in more than 15 years of going there, I never once had to use that. Set it off accidentally once. That was unpleasant. But, anyway, we used to be allowed to bring in refreshments once a month, just for an hour of fellowship with our group. And so one day I was coming in with these plastic grocery bags with cookies and coffee, And the officer checking me in at the gate said, "Oh, no, you can't bring those in here." I thought maybe there had been a change in the cookie and coffee policy that nobody had bothered to tell me about. So I was asking. He goes, "No, no, the cookies are fine. Just, but plastic bags are contraband." And he said, "You can come through this time, but don't bring plastic bags in the future. Make sure you bring all of those back out with you." So I thought this was all very strange. So when I got to the chapel, I asked the guys, "What's the deal about plastic bags?" Well, they told me they can be used to make wine. So, in case you ever want to make some home brewed prison wine, here's your recipe: steal some fruit, whatever you can get your hands on. In fact, in a pinch, ketchup will work, anything with sugar in it. Put it in a plastic bag with some crumbled up bread for the yeast and hang it up in a dark place out of sight. Before long, you have wine. Not good wine, mind you, but it'll give you a buzz. So I learned a lot during my visits to a correctional institution. Most of what I learned didn't have very much to do with making wine, although I'll share some things that you probably never consider doing with dried ramen noodles or Cheetos. Mostly, I learned a lot about the nature of freedom, about the relationship of freedom of body and freedom of mind, and that to be in prison is not necessarily to be a prisoner. I got to know people who had been written off by society, by their families, but who nevertheless managed somehow to free their lives. And I came to see very clearly that we're in greater danger of being imprisoned by the workings of our own minds than we are by walls and steel bars. So from the outside, Tomoka Correctional Institution looks a lot like a 1970s community college, only with a 10-foot chain link fence with razor wire on top. And I was terrified when I got there on my first day. I had assumed that a guard would escort me where I was supposed to go, because that's what happens in the movies, right? But no, they processed me through the gate and I was on my own. Fortunately, another chapel volunteer came through about the same time I did, and so he walked me over to the chapel. So about 4 guys came to our first meeting, and that grew quite a bit over time. Attendance waxes and wanes as new people arrive and others are released or transferred to other facilities. I visited the last time I went back to Florida, which was last spring, and about 24 guys are attending the service there. And I was glad to see that the group had held together that way. But leading meetings there challenged me to really get to know the Buddha's teachings very deeply. From the very beginning, guys were full of questions. Different schools of Buddhism resonate with different people. And so that's true for them too. And they have a lot of time to read and that sort of stuff. So we basically operated like a Zen group, but there were some who were reading Dharma talks by the great Thai masters, and some who wanted to practice Tibetan Lam Rim meditation, where you work with these complex visualizations of Buddhas and stuff like that. One of the guys one day started talking to me about Pure Land Buddhism, which is very faith-based. I never took much of an interest in it up to that point because it reminded me a lot of the kind of religion that I grew up with. But he had read a book on the subject and he had experienced a genuine awakening. So this book had explained that anyone, even someone who did bad things like him, was still accepted and could still find spiritual peace. And I was very moved by what he had to say. And so it opened me up more to this. The conversation really transformed me as a teacher. It gave me a taste of greater freedom in my own mind by freeing me from some of my preconceptions about Buddhist practice. And it taught me to meet others where they stand, to be a better companion on the spiritual path. Regardless of which school of Buddhism they got into, though, these guys were all looking for the same things, probably the same things that you come here for: a way to live a better life, a more peaceful life, a life with greater meaning and purpose. Well, one week there were some newcomers, and we started talking about why people came to services every week. And there was one guy who summed it up really well. He said, I started coming because I wanted peace of mind, and I got that. But it also helps me understand what causes my problems better. And he said, usually I'd be in confinement right now, meaning locked up in solitary. But this Buddhist practice helps me with my anger, helps me put up with the things that go on around me. There was another guy, a Muslim, who had come into the room for some reason. I think during Ramadan, they met in the chapel every day, and I think their meeting overlapped with ours. But anyway, he walked through the room while we were meeting at some point, and he said, something was really different here. So I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wanted to be a part of it. And one week, one of the chapel clerks came up to me after a meeting, and he was telling me that he was being transferred to a lower security facility. And what he said really helped me understand what we were accomplishing in this place. He said, as you can imagine, a lot of these guys live in the past, remembering the things that they did before they were in here. And a lot of them live in the future, thinking about what they're going to do when they get out. But one thing I learned from being with you guys, if you want happiness, you have to have it here and now. So I'll tell that story quite often, sometimes to myself, but I'm thinking about the future, about how nice it'll be when the political situation changes, or being nostalgic for times maybe when our society seemed to be moving toward a more equal vision. And this is the nice thing about the Buddhist teaching on impermanence. The stuff you don't like is also impermanent. But I remember what this guy said. He said, if you want to be happy, you have to do it now. And if you want to be free, you have to recognize that without freeing our mind from attachments that lead to suffering, no lack of physical and social constraint will really make us free. Well, the Buddha offered a path to freedom, but that path is only available to us because we have freedom. We have the ability to free our minds. We're truly free when we decide to act out of compassion instead of anger, when we act out of generosity instead of greed, when we decide not to go for refuge to booze or television or money, but to seek refuge in a spiritual path. I'm sure you know the line from me and Bobby McGee, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Well, think about that in terms of the mind. What keeps us stuck in our stress? The idea that we have to cling to things, we have to hold on to things, to our material wealth, sure, but also to the ideas that kind of keep our ego running in circles around itself. An incarcerated person can lose everything in a moment. Talk back to a guard, you lose whatever little freedom you have. When they put you in confinement, they also open up your locker and confiscate anything that looks remotely like contraband, so you can lose all your possessions overnight. But even for us, as long as we're clinging to the idea that freedom comes from wealth or power or whatever, we're always going to be potentially in a prison of our own making. So the guys who have jobs in prison or families that send them money can buy a few things from the canteen. They're not allowed to own very much. Their choices are pretty limited. One of my teachers, Greg Creech, runs an institute in Vermont where they teach Japanese psychology. And he likes to work with maxims, little short teachings that cause a shift in our attention. And one of my favorites is examine life outside the boundaries of your suffering. It's a useful thing to remember. Yes, I'm suffering, but what else is going on? So in their situation, they almost do this instinctively. Some of them sometimes find pleasure and contentment in very little. So one Tuesday, this guy started talking about his birthday party, which had happened the previous week. His friends in his dorm had wanted to throw him a celebration. And so he had arranged this party, and he had made dinner, a nice dinner to share with everybody. So I asked him about that. I said, how do you make dinner in your dorm? He said, oh, I made soup. And then he talked about his favorite soup recipe. So his friends had donated packages of ramen noodles for his party. So you know that top ramen stuff that you buy in the supermarket? It's like 6 packages for $2. They sell it at the canteen, the prison commissary, for a few bucks each package. So like I figured it's like a 600 or 800% markup. Pretty good profit for the state of Florida, right? Anyway, the seasoning packets were the soup base, and and then he embellished it with other things. So there were pieces of meat that guys had smuggled out of the chow hall in their pockets, probably. There were Slim Jims, which you can get at the canteen. You know, Slim Jim is hard little dried sausage, right? They had hoarded packets of ketchup and hot sauce. And so he used those, and he'd crunched up bags of Cheetos to make it cheesy. So it was this sort of cheese, chicken, mystery meat, vegetable, Slim Jim, hot and spicy noodle soup. Sounds delicious, doesn't it? Apparently, it was a big hit. And then somebody had taken some of the leftover ramen noodles and they add hot water from the sink to make them kind of pliable. And then kind of squeeze in some sugar and peanut butter, and which they get out of little plastic packets in the canteen, mash it all together, shape it into a disc, and let it dry out. And you have a peanut butter cookie of sorts. And that was his birthday cake. So one time at an event at White Sands Buddhist Center, somebody asked me how I could have compassion for convicted felons. And I thought about it and I said, you know, except for the workings of karma, any of us could have been locked up. Maybe not so much you guys, I could have been. Anyway, there's this famous poem by Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, Call Me by My True Names. And he talks about having compassion for sadistic pirates by recognizing that if he had grown up like they did, if he was born where they were and grew up the way they did, and with their karma, he'd be a pirate too. So were it not for the karma that put you here, you might be a pirate or even a politician. So some of these guys didn't have much of a chance to turn out any other way than they did. Some got into really bad situations when they were young, but they're working hard to train their minds to prevent them going back into trouble so that they don't come back if they ever get out. A few know that they'll never leave, but with their Buddhist practice, they find meaning and purpose in life. So I used to joke with people that Tuesdays were always good days because I got out of jail on Tuesday. And it gets a laugh, but it's true. Going there always reminded me how fortunate that I am to be in this body, in this place, in this time, and to be free. I had this little ritual that I always do when I get out. I'll pause and just be outside the gate and be aware that I'm outside. I take a moment to be grateful to be there, to not be surrounded by fences and razor wire. And then I remind myself that walking out the gate only takes me part way to freedom. I need to continue moment by moment to untie myself from my own bonds of ego, of attachment, of aversion, so that I can experience true liberation. So thank you very much for your attention.